Hello and welcome to this special policy forum hosted by the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, the Siegel Executive Director of the Institute. There have been lots of headline moments in the Middle East, but there have been very few that were pivotal events that dramatically and fundamentally changed the course of the region or changed the direction of America's engagement in the region. The wars in 67 and 73 were such events. 9/11 was another. The 1979 revolution in Iran was certainly one of these events. What we don't know yet is whether America's engagement in military action against Iran, America's attack on 3 nuclear sites, the first direct military attack on Iran by the United States, and when combined with Israel's week-long attack, the first time Iran has been on the receiving end of bombs and missiles in nearly 40 years, we don't know if this will be another such event. Today, with my outstanding panel of colleagues, we're going to look closely at what happened, what is likely to happen, and how all of this may reshape the Middle East, politically, militarily, diplomatically, and strategically. As we do this, let me open with just 2 analytical caveats. First, history is a guide, not a straitjacket. As a historian, I'm the first to say it's essential to learn from history, but it's important not to fall prey to the lazy notion that it repeats itself. There is a lot of that going on. From saying that Iran will necessarily respond to U.S. attacks this weekend the same way it responded in limited fashion to the targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani. Well, maybe not. Also to saying that Iran 2025, which so far saw 25 minutes of U.S. air and submarine bombing, is a repeat of Iraq 2003, which had 150,000 plus U.S. troops invade, overthrow, and occupy a country. The world is very different. Our leadership is very different. More importantly, our experience is very different, not least for having gone through the last 2 decades. So, caveat 1, let's be analytical, not simplistic. Second caveat, not everyone thinks, acts, and prioritizes the way we would if we were in their shoes. This is another analytical pitfall we have to avoid. Some choices Iran has are objectively self-defeating, like closing the Straits of Hormuz because it relies on access to exports for its oil, or attacking U.S. civilian targets, which is certain to trigger a massive, overwhelming U.S. response. But none of that means definitively Iran won't choose one of those paths, or something else that may appear self-defeating to us. Perhaps for them, or more specifically, for the few people in Iran who make decisions and really matter, there is a different calculus at work. We need to be open to that. With those 2 words of warning, let's turn to my colleagues. First, I'll turn to Dana Stroll. Dana is the Shelley and Michael Casson Senior Fellow and Director of Research here at the Washington Institute. She served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, the most senior civilian position in the Pentagon throughout the Biden administration. Then we'll turn to Israel, where we'll be joined by Ambassador Michael Herzog. Mike served with distinction as Israel's envoy to the United States for more than 3 years, including the especially challenging 16 months after October 7th, 2023. I'm delighted that Mike is rejoining the Institute as our Tisch Distinguished Fellow. As I said, he's joining us from Tel Aviv. And then third, we'll be joined by Ambassador Dennis Ross. Dennis was a junior official in the Pentagon when Ayatollah Khomeini swept into power in the late 1970s. And over those decades since, Dennis rose to serve in high office for 4 presidents, 2 Republicans, Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and 2 Democrats, Clinton and Obama. He is the author of a new book on statecraft that has a lot to tell us about where we are today and where we may be going. So first, I'll be turning to Dana. Let me just remind everyone, if you'd like to get into our questions, if you'd like to get into our conversation, please use either the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom bar or email me directly. I will be monitoring my email at rsatloff, R-S-A-T-L-O-F-F, at washingtoninstitute.org. Dana, the floor is yours.
It's a pleasure to be with such a distinguished panel today. So I look forward to learning from everybody. What I'd like to do is highlight and speak about some of the remarkable features of the U.S. military operation the world learned about if you were in the United States late on Saturday night, and if you were in the Middle East or beyond early in the morning, either in the middle of the night or when you were waking up. Put what we just saw in some context of experience over the past couple years, and then remark on what the scenarios are on the other side of these military operations. So first, after the Hamas terrorist attacks of October 7th, 2023, the U.S. military adopted, and at the direction of President Biden, very clear objectives for how U.S. military force would be used in the Middle East. And there was a significant buildup of U.S. military posture in the Middle East to support those objectives. The first was to support Israel's ability to defend itself, not only from Hamas, but from the Ring of Fire and the other Iran-supported, backed, armed, and trained proxies that were targeting Israel. Secondly was a acknowledgement that even though Israel was under significant pressure and needed support in its ability to defend itself, the conflict and the war could even be worse. That a regional conflagration where total war across societies, U.S. forces, the partners of the United States, the targeting of civilian or energy infrastructure far beyond the borders of Israel was a possibility as Iran looked around the region and the regime in Tehran thought through what its next steps would be. So a second major U.S. priority with its military buildup and military activities was to prevent full-scale regional escalation. And finally, it was to protect U.S. forces, of which tens of thousands were deployed across the Middle East in 2023. And if you look over the immediate period of time after the October 7th terrorist attacks, U.S. forces were on the receiving end of Iran-affiliated and backed militia attacks, specifically in Iraq and Syria, at the same time that U.S. forces were supporting Israel's defense at home. And then over time, the Houthis in Yemen also stepped in, attacking U.S. naval vessels transiting the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb strategic maritime choke point, as well as Iran-affiliated networks like the Houthis attacking commercial shipping and other vessels transiting the Red Sea. So over time, the U.S. response was both to organize multilateral defensive coalitions and only undertake U.S. military action against interests, against Iran-affiliated threats in the region in what the Biden administration identified as self-defense or defensive actions. What we saw over the weekend was a decisive shift in how the U.S. military and Washington is using military force under the direction of President Trump. And the shift is from using force in a defensive manner, either in defense of U.S. interests or in defense of Israel, and switching to offensive military action, not against Iran threats in the region, but against threats inside Iran directly, precisely, and specifically. Quite a shift. And one of the big questions going forward is, will the United States now revert to how it's used military force previously, or will we now see more examples of President Trump directing offensive U.S. military strikes? The Operation Midnight Hammer that we saw from the United States is remarkable. And here I want to acknowledge the exceptional skill and professionalism of the American military, its service members, and the lives that were on the line to accomplish this mission. And it builds on, of course, the tremendous operational successes of the Israel Defense Forces. So first of all, the coordination in a military sense that we saw is noteworthy. What happened was the IDF has been engaged in a continuing campaign for more than a week in Iran, but IDF aircraft cleared and then evacuated airspace, ceased their operations in order for the U.S. military to exercise its airstrikes. And then as soon as U.S. fighter aircraft had left Iranian airspace, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, immediately resumed their operations to continue pressure on a variety of Iranian targets. This was the largest B-2 operational strike in U.S. military history. To remind listeners, the B-2 is a specific platform that can carry the special munitions, the MOP, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, which was used to get at the hard and deeply buried targets of Fordow, where the Iranians had an underground enrichment facility. What is equally remarkable about the B-2 operational strike is that part of B-2 stationed in the United States actually flew west and into the Pacific as a decoy, while other bombers flew east, minimized their communications with each other, and then were accompanied by a variety of other aircraft as those bombers got closer to Iranian airspace. The kind of coordination that our U.S. military just demonstrated in executing this strike required exceptional coordination from U.S. Strategic Command, Transportation Command, Cyber Command, Space Command, Space Force, European Command, and obviously Central Command, CENTCOM, which is the headquarters for U.S. military operations in the Middle East. There were 14 massive ordnance penetrators dropped in less than 30 minutes of the U.S. military strikes in Iran. And reportedly, Iranian air defense, or what's left of it, did not even see the U.S. package enter Iranian airspace. In short, this operation combined the B-2 stealth bombers, fourth and fifth generation fighter aircraft, dozens of air refueling tankers, a guided missile submarine, and a full array of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft, and hundreds of maintenance and operational professionals, all of course adhere to remarkable operational security, so that most of what the world saw over the weekend was a complete surprise. In short, there is no military in the world other than the U.S. military who can pull off an operation of such operational complexity so far from its own territory. This should put the Iranian regime on notice. It should put other adversaries in other theaters on notice that when the president directs such a operation, the U.S. military can meet the demand of the moment. And it should also reassure allies and partners who have questioned whether or not the United States is willing to back up its threats to use force when necessary. Putting this in context, this is not an operation that the U.S. military executed within 1 week's time after Israel initiated its campaign in Iran. There were many steps that had to proceed in order for the U.S. military to be positioned to execute on President Trump's orders, and I think it's important to reflect on that. Number one, we probably could not have seen what we just did if Israel had not been transferred from the European Command into Central Command, i.e., expanding the opportunities for integration with U.S. military forces and activities in the Middle East. Secondly, this reflects remarkable commitment all the way from the presidential level to the operational and tactical levels in both Israel and the United States to be as interoperable and militarily cooperative as we just saw these two militaries. One of the ways in which we know that these two militaries were prepared to execute such a complex operation are exercises like the Juniper Oak exercise, which is an all-domain exercise, i.e. cyber, space, land, air, and sea all at once, well before October 7, 2023. There are only in the Middle East one military that could do an all-domain exercise like this or operate across all domains with the United States, and it is the Israel Defense Forces. Finally, operational plans like this do not come together in 1 week. It is the result of resource prioritization to have these fighter aircraft, to have the munitions ready, and to make sure that these sorts of plans could work together. This is the second time we've seen preparedness in years prior to the Trump administration coming into office, positioning them in order to execute these kinds of operations. The first was the Trump administration's execution of its operations against the Houthis in Yemen 2 months ago, and now we see it again here. This builds on exceptional continuity in military policy leadership and resourcing across the U.S. government. What we know is that there has been significant damage to Iran's nuclear program, and certainly its ability to rush for a nuclear weapons program has been set back. We do not yet have a full battlefield damage assessment as to exactly how much destruction has taken place. A few scenarios for the United States going forward here. President Trump has expressed a desire to return to diplomacy and talks. It could be that there are negotiations on the other side of these military strikes with a regime that's ready to negotiate. Prior to the initiation of Israel's campaign and the U.S. military strikes, it was quite clear that negotiations had run their course, were at an impasse. Before Israel strikes, the IAEA Director General had been quite clear that there is no peaceful explanation for Iran's nuclear program. And in the middle of Israel's campaign in Iran, the G7 actually stood together and doubled down on its commitment to preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon. Also in the middle of Israel's campaign, the ministers of the E3, Paris, London, and Berlin, met with the foreign minister of Iran, who insisted that all Israeli operations must stop before the Iranians would even contemplate discussions and diplomacy. This reflects either a refusal or an inability to understand the real weak position that Iran is in at this moment. So perhaps after the U.S. strikes, there's a change in appetite within the regime to actually negotiate. So option one, negotiations with a willing, open, and compliant regime. Number two, is there some sort of negotiations on the other side of war, but with a continuously intransigent and resistant regime. This would introduce complexities for whether IAEA inspectors can regain access and entry into Iran, and what we will actually be able to verify about the destruction. Or there are no negotiations in the near term, and the U.S. Undertakes further strikes against the Iranian nuclear program. We don't know yet. And of course, Iran also has response options. Though to date, what remains of its threat network, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, militias in Iraq, some militias in Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen all appear to, at least in the short term, be taking a knee, only offering rhetorical support, but basically saying, Iran, you can defend yourself, just as you have left us to defend ourselves over the past year since Israel's operations across the region post-October 7th. There are, of course, still opportunities for elements of this threat network to attack U.S. interests. Now there are more areas of vulnerability because we have 40,000 U.S. forces deployed across the Middle East, 2 aircraft carrier groups, more fighter squadrons. So there's a possibility that Iran activates its threat network in the near term. Iran historically has at times sought to drive a wedge between the United States and its allies, either Israel or Gulf partners, by targeting U.S. forces to impose consequences for Israeli military actions, to target Gulf energy infrastructure or shipping containers, to impose costs on the Gulf for hosting U.S. forces in response to U.S. pressure, like the maximum pressure campaign during the first Trump administration. So Iran could expand the aperture of its strikes. Since the Israeli campaign, Iran has only targeted Israel, including Israeli population centers, with ballistic missiles and drones, but Iran could choose to direct what remains of its missile arsenal and drones at Gulf energy infrastructure, economic infrastructure, or U.S. forces at bases across the Middle East. Then there are the elements of Iran's threat network that remain untouched. One is its offensive cyber operations. Another is its network of sleeper cells that it has long cultivated across Europe, the Western Hemisphere, and even in the United States, which we of course know related to the disclosure of criminal cases that the Department of Justice has put together, showing that Iran actually seeks to hire hitmen and others to engage in targeted assassinations. Finally, I think it's important to reflect on the long timeline of Iranian response options. So assuming that the strikes of the past week by Israel and the one night of strikes by the United States does not compel a regime that has invested decades in its nuclear program, its threat network, its missile arsenal, etc., does not compel the regime to decide now is the time to make meaningful concessions, the Iranians will have a long memory. So even if we don't see specific near-term heightened risk or attacks in the coming days, it will require enormous vigilance and resourcing across the U.S. intelligence community and coordination with Israel and others across the world to counter, mitigate, and prevent the variety of Iranian retaliatory options that they may consider in years to come.
Thank you. Very sobering. Thank you very much, Dana. We're going to turn now to Ambassador Mike Herzog, joining us from Israel. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's a pleasure to be with you. As you said, I'm approaching you from Israel, and so I'll provide an Israeli perspective here. And I'll start by saying that there is a direct connection between the current war with Iran and October 7th. And the reason I say it is because while Hamas carried out October 7th uncoordinated with the remaining elements of the Iranian axis, it basically implemented an Iranian long-term strategic plan to destroy the state of Israel. Whoever saw the intelligence realized that this was not only a vision, it was an operational plan with a time frame, with build-up of forces. Hamas was built up according to this plan. The time frame, by the way, was to destroy Israel until 2040. And by way of anecdote, I will tell you that in one of the central squares in Tehran, Palestine Square, they placed a clock with a countdown to 2040 when Israel is destroyed. That clock was bombed today by the Israeli Air Force. But what we soon understood after October 7th that we are challenged not only by Hamas, but by the whole Iranian axis. And even though it wasn't coordinated with them tactically, they joined. And they were gradually drawn in until we found ourselves confronting Hezbollah, Iran, and the rest of the axis. And we understood that we cannot finish that war without dealing with Iran and the Iranian axis. We cannot just finish the war by defeating Hamas. So after we basically degraded Hezbollah, deterred Iran, took action against the whole axis, even the Houthis, and after Syria collapsed, Israel fixed its gaze on Iran itself, the big prize, what's called the head of the snake. And in fact, the specific planning for the current campaign was started in November, after the last round with Iran and after Hezbollah was hit hard. And it was a new type of plan. It was a new concept, no longer pinpointed strikes on nuclear sites. It was a much broader, bigger campaign against the Iranian system to weaken it so that it'll be much more difficult for the system itself to reconstruct its strategic capabilities. Iran, I believe, misread Israel totally. Like Nasrallah, they failed to understand that post-October 7th, Israel is a totally different country and will no longer tolerate the build-up of capabilities in the hands of actors calling for its destruction in Israel's neighborhood. Now, the decision on the campaign against Iran became time-sensitive because of a unique combination of necessity and opportunity. On the side of necessity, mainly because the nuclear program while Iran became a nuclear threshold state in terms of enrichment, what we've seen over the last few months is Iran resuming research and development in its weaponization system. It doesn't mean that it was already a decision to go to the bomb, but the decision was to allow for advanced research and development of elements related to weaponization, so that if and when Iran makes that decision, it will take a much shorter time frame. We also saw that Iran was rebuilding its ground-to-ground missile capabilities by way that could enable it within a few years to master an arsenal of well over 10,000 missiles. And I will tell you that the way the Israelis look at it, such a salvo overwhelming our defenses is tantamount to a nuclear bomb. So the whole idea was to take action to neutralize the nuclear capability and the missile capability of Iran. And there was an opportunity because the shields that Iran built around its strategic capabilities, Hezbollah, Syria, and air defense, Iranian air defense itself, were hit by Israel. And Israel also saw an opportunity in the fact that they believed that an Israeli operation would be green-lighted by President Trump, which it was. I also want to say, before I go to analyzing what exactly Israel did in Iran, that in Israel, there's a broad consensus in our public, in our society around this operation, unlike many other issues where Israelis are divided, not on Iran. As it relates to Iran, the targets that were set for this operation or this campaign were to hit hard and neutralize as much as possible the Iranian nuclear program, set it back for a number of years, to do the same to the ballistic missile program, and to create the conditions for follow-on pressure that will totally neutralize the nuclear program, either by diplomacy, if the US strikes a deal with Iran, which really keeps them away from enrichment, or by further military action down the road. In order to achieve these goals, Israel focused on the following elements. The first was surprise, and Israel achieved surprise that really took the Iranians off balance. The second was the decapitation of the senior defense leadership that introduced not only shock and awe, but also disrupted their decision-making process in terms of how to respond to Israel. The third element was achieving air supremacy so that we have free skies. We can fly freely to Iran and over Iran. And this was achieved, and this is a major, major achievement because we're talking about targets over 1,500 kilometers away from Israel, over 1,000 miles. In one case, our Air Force bombed a target in Mashhad, 2,300 kilometers away from Israel. This is amazing. We are there every day, a few times a day. And this is as if we're flying over Beirut. I think all of us who've been in the defense establishment for many years could only dream about such an achievement. The next element was degrading Iranian missile capabilities, which are the main tool with which Iran can inflict damage on Israel and also on American assets. Iran entered this war with an estimated arsenal of around 2,500 ballistic missiles and several hundred launchers, less than 400. The IDF believes that by now they have destroyed or incapacitated around 2/3 of this arsenal. Over 50% were destroyed. Iran also fired at Israel nearly 500 missiles, but about around 50% were destroyed and the rest are incapacitated, trapped in mountainous tunnels and so on. They still have capabilities, but I can tell you as someone who sits in Tel Aviv and spends a few hours every night in a bomb shelter, the frequency and the volume of their salvos has gone down over the last few days. They still inflict damage, but they don't have the same capacity that they had in the beginning, certainly cannot implement their plans. And then the most important is, of course, the nuclear facilities. And the idea was to focus on all the critical elements of their program, enrichment facilities, facilities where they manufacture centrifuges, everything that has to do with weaponization, and taking out those scientists was a major element of that, because there's unique knowledge that they have lost. Isfahan, where they produced metallic uranium, which is critical in producing a weapon and everything that goes with it. Israelis believe that they dealt together with the U.S., which I'll relate to in a moment, really a serious blow to the Iranian nuclear program, took it back by some say 2 years. I would be very careful. It's premature to make that assessment. There's one sensitive element that we have to follow very closely, and that is where is the enriched material, especially in material enriched to 60%. Where is it? Iranians claim they still have it. What can they do with it? And so on. The Israeli plan also included other types of targets, but Israel hardly hit economic targets. I think they were kept to potential escalation if Iran does certain things against Israel or against to respond to the US. And there are targets that have to do with the stability of the regime. This was not defined an Israeli war goal to topple the regime, a regime change. It is not defined as a war goal, but Israeli leadership talks a lot about it, I think by way of warning Iran that if they escalate, we could target some critical elements of the regime. In fact, we have done some of it, Basij headquarters, the Evin prison, and some other targets that have to do with the regime. But the hope is that following that war, there will be a chain reaction that may destabilize the regime, something we, of course, would all like to see. All of this was planned under the assumption that the United States is going to provide Israel defensive capabilities, help us with defense, political cover, and all sorts of other types of cooperation. But Israel did not know in advance whether or not the United States will join in the attack, in attacking the Iranian nuclear facilities. So the whole planning was built on the assumption that we may have to do it alone, and we'll do it alone. But the fact that the US joined is, of course, a major game changer in many ways. First of all, in its capabilities. Second, in the commitment that this sends across, that the United States is going to enforce its interest of denying Iran nuclearization, not only in words, but also in deeds. It could create further deterrence against Iran and ultimately help all of us in finding the proper exit strategy. And I second what Dana said about the unique, unbelievable cooperation between our two militaries. I witnessed it firsthand when I was ambassador in Washington. I know this is really unprecedented. Where are we headed to? This depends to a great extent on how Iran responds to the US strike. And one, they have quite a few options. I think Dana listed some of them. The main tool they have is missiles, but as I say, it was degraded. They do have shorter range projectiles. They have proxies that they could put to use. They are talking about closing the straits, blocking the export of oil. I agree with what you said, Rob, that this will be self-defeating because they stand to lose their economy, their ability to export oil, their navy, and many other assets. So if I were them, I would think twice. The same goes for targeting the oil fields of some of the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as they have done in the past. And they have many tools of terror. But ultimately, I think The current situation is such that you can project deterrence vis-a-vis Iran. This stands much to lose. They are weakened. And in fact, both the US and Israel are sending those deterrent messages, telling the Iranians, if you go a bridge too far, then you could be further destroyed. Talking about an exit strategy, there are several options or scenarios, and very briefly, I would like to outline them. The first and the best one is that Iran, under the pressure, will say, okay, we're going back to the negotiating table, and we now accept what we rejected earlier in terms of a nuclear deal. I don't see it in the very near future. It may come if Iran is able to tell itself and the world that they responded forcibly, or if they believe there is a threat to the regime. It may come at a later stage. But I believe that one real red line for Iran would be the demand that their right on which would be recognized by the deal. And I think the US and Israel have to think very hard if now, after the war, this is an acceptable proposition. The second scenario is cessation of hostilities, some kind of a ceasefire, either brokered by a third party, the Russians are trying, for example, or suggested by the United States or Israel, even Israel, unilaterally saying, okay, we achieved our goals, now we stop bombing Iran. And if you, Iran, continue to send missiles, then we'll resume our forceful activities against you. Or if we see you trying to reconstruct your nuclear program, missile program, and so on and so forth. All of these are potential scenarios, but I think in any case, both Israel and the United States, in any of these scenarios, have to maintain the ability to take action, preventive action, if we see that Iran is trying to reconstruct its strategic capabilities. The third option is that Iran will respond to the United States in a way that draws the US further in. I don't think they are stupid enough to do so, but let's see. And the fourth option is that they try to drag the state of Israel into a war of attrition, like daily salvos, in which case I anticipate that Israel will step up its operation to destabilize this regime. So these are the general scenarios. And in closing, I would say that I do hope that in thinking about the exit strategy, both the US and Israel should think in broad terms about the region. I would be very happy if we include in it some kind of a resolution to the Gaza situation. I think the current war provides our government the space to say, we established deterrence. We can close that war in Gaza, of course, based on freeing our hostages. I would like to see renewed thinking about breaking through to normalization with Saudi Arabia. And when the dust settles, both Israel and the United States have to think hard about the future model of our defense relations. We have an MOU currently. We have agreements about qualitative military edge. All of this, we have to sit down to the drawing table and think about all of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for underscoring the long agenda that we have ahead, collectively, the two sides. I'm about to turn to Dennis, but let me just remind all of our viewers, if you'd like to get into our conversation, please send your question either to the Q&A function of your Zoom bar, if you're joining us on Zoom, or if you're joining us on another platform, please send an email directly to me, rsatloff, R-S-A-T-L-O-F-F, at washingtoninstitute.org. I'll turn now to Ambassador Dennis Ross. Dennis, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rob. Look, I think Dana and Mike have made very insightful comments that create a kind of broad framing for what has gone on, what the possible responses and options are going to be. Let me telescope a number of observations given that. And number one, it bears repeating. This has been an extraordinary military achievement by the Israelis up until the U.S. strikes, and then by the U.S. military as well. And both Dana and Mike talked about the extraordinary coordination that preceded this and the preparations that preceded this on both sides. But extraordinary military achievements, as important as they are to change the landscape, both practically and psychologically, still require being translated into something that produces an enduring political outcome. What is it that the Trump administration hoped to do? When the president came in, he made it very clear he wanted to be seen as being a peacemaker. The effort to deal with the nuclear issue in Iran was also something else he said that he would deal with. He said they'll have no nukes, and he pursued that diplomatically. He came to the conclusion that that was not going to be achievable through diplomatic means, and so he made the decision to act militarily. There's no doubt that he, in explaining this, and also in terms of what the vice president has said, this is not a declaration of war on Iran. It was an effort to deal exclusively with the Iranian nuclear program, to, in a sense, make practical what the president was saying. Iran would not have a nuclear weapon, and I would, in a sense, interpret that to mean Iran is losing its nuclear weapons option, and we have applied military force to ensure that. Now, it's true we don't know exactly yet the full nature of destruction. Is the Fordo plant, is the Fordo enrichment site completely destroyed or just severely damaged? Will there need to be some follow-on? That remains to be seen. Have the Iranians been able to secret away some stocks of highly enriched uranium? Maybe. But I would also say, even if they have, this notion that they can quickly turn around and turn that into a nuclear weapon, I think sort of belies the condition that they're in. One of the things that has not been focused on enough, and Mike was sort of touching on it, you have a military that has been decapitated. You have a Revolutionary Guard that has been decapitated. You have people in both those leaderships that had been basically together for the last 30 years. They're not so easy to replace. You have a leadership that doesn't know who it can trust. You have a leadership that is completely in hiding. To be able to plan and to divert resources to that effort, especially not knowing what Israel knows or what the U.S. knows or what we'd be prepared to do. Again, for all those who say they'll be able to rush to a bomb, I think they ignore the circumstances in which the Iranian leadership currently is. They don't know who they can trust. They don't know if they can even trust their own communications. Mike talked about how disrupted they were. I was in Israel. I know when we got the alert from the Israeli government about having launched the strikes, there was an anticipation there was going to be a very quick Iranian response. That's why we were alerted at 3 in the morning. But in fact, nothing happened for 18 hours. And I think that was not just a function of the shock, it was also a function of the disruption. That disruption still relates to whatever they might do when this ends. Okay, we heard this discussion from both Dana and Mike about the array of their response options. I want to put this in a context. There's a history here. One of the things that, having investigated this in the new book that I've done, one of the things that stands out with the Iranians is regime survival is the first, second, third, and fourth, fifth, and sixth preoccupation. One conclusion they drew early on, as a result of the American reflagging of ships during the Iran-Iraq War, do not get into a war with the United States because that could threaten the regime survival. Based on that, that has not only driven that, it's also driven a sense that when we need to make tactical concessions, we will. So where are we right now in terms of what the Iranians may do? I do think it's likely that the supreme leader will want to show that they did something in response to what the U.S. did. The full array of different possibilities both Dana and Mike talked about. My sense is they will want to do something symbolic so they can claim they responded, but the supreme leader will look for a way out. Now, he will not want to look weak. When I said regime survival is the preoccupation, it cuts in two different ways. To look excessively weak because it looked like they capitulated us will be seen as potentially inviting a threat to the regime, either from those within Iran who are, in a sense, the principalists and who fear for doing something like this, or from people who might see an opening to change the character of the regime, or even from some on the outside. Looking weak is a threat to the regime in the mindset of the regime. But also engaging in a war with the United States is almost certainly a more immediate threat to the survival of the regime. So again, I say there'll be some effort to, I think, retaliate in a symbolic way. There'll be some decision then to look for a way out. I do think it is easier for the regime to look like it's responding to a Russian proposal to stop, or a Chinese proposal, or some kind of joint Russian-Chinese proposal, than it is to respond to the United States. To respond to the United States looks like they're submitting to the United States. To respond to a proposal to end the war from the Russians and or the Chinese looks like they're working with their friends who have an interest in their future. It looks much less like a capitulation. Where would President Trump come out on that? We know that the way he views President Putin is such that he wouldn't mind. I think that he sees working with Putin would be a testament to the relationship that he says he's had over time. The whole issue of Ukraine we can get into from Putin's standpoint, scoring points with President Trump, helping to ensure that this doesn't turn into some kind of a prolonged conflict, something that the president absolutely does not want, something that in a sense hasn't been appreciated enough. He made a decision to confront his own base, which didn't want him to do this. But that doesn't mean he will want to get into what he himself has called forever wars in the Middle East. So if the Russians and or the Chinese can help him out of that, I fully expect that that will be something that might be pursued. Last word I want to say, this picks up on something that Mike was saying. You look at Prime Minister Netanyahu, this was his Winston Churchill issue. This was an issue for him that he has been preoccupied with for as long as I've known him. He's raised this over the decades. I've heard it from him in the 1990s. I heard it from him in 2007. This is an issue for him that helps to define why he's prime minister. Now, if he's able to come out of this and declare a remarkable success, it's not just that it reduces the stain of October 7th. It puts him in a position, I'll go beyond what Mike was saying. Mike was talking about what he would like to see. I think it puts Prime Minister Netanyahu in a position where he can say, I'm now going to build on this victory by getting the hostages out. I'm going to declare an end to we're prepared to end the war and withdraw from Gaza. He will need, working with us, a day after plan, but there is work that has been done in the past that I think can be basically called upon now. He will need that. He has a built-in credibility that if Hamas violates any deal that is worked out, where they try to reconstitute themselves, no one will question that Israel will respond. Not after what they've done to Hamas, Hezbollah, and now Iran itself. The credibility that Israel has in terms of making any threats at this point are probably higher than they've ever been. So his capacity to go ahead and end the war in Gaza, get the hostages back, which will be a victory on top of Iran, I think is such that we're very likely to see that, and it will respond for sure to what President Trump wants. He wants to be able to say, I use force, and look at the effect of our using force. Not only did it basically set back the Iranian nuclear program forever, but also it contributed to ending the war in Gaza, in a sense substantiating his basic self-image and what he wants people to understand. He's a peacemaker, and he's not someone who's going to get us involved in these wars that go on forever. I'll stop there.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you all very much. We have quite a slew of questions that focus in part on what happened this weekend and in part on where we, the Iranians, Israel, the Middle East is going as a result of this weekend. So first, let me ask a couple of questions about this weekend. Dana, I have a number of questions asking about the execution of Operation Midnight Hammer. Were there other countries involved? Were there other air forces involved? Were there countries that gave basing rights, participated in refueling, or made other contributions to the success of this operation?
Thanks for that question. So first of all, Secretary of State Rubio gave an interview to Fox News yesterday where he talked about the importance of U.S. basing in the Middle East, and he tied U.S. basing in the Middle East to the threat of Iran. So he essentially said, the reason that we have bases and we have forces deployed in the Middle East is Iran. So the extension of that would be that if the threats from Iran ceased, the United States would no longer need to maintain its bases and its forces in the Middle East. And frankly, this is wrong. The U.S. Uses our bases and our forces in the Middle East for a variety of different activities. Some of it is about Iran. Some of it is about supporting the defense of our partners. And a lot of it is about relationship building. So we use our forces to exercise. I had mentioned earlier the exercising we do with the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. We exercise with all of our partners. We do naval ship transits, port calls, all sorts of different activities to basically exercise and maintain healthy military relationships. And the reason we have bases and the reason that the United States wants healthy military relationships is because we are the most combat credible, most flexible, rapidly deployable military force in the history of the world. And if it doesn't take a genius to look at a map, look at the geostrategic location of the Middle East and understand why we would want very healthy bases and relationships with our partners in the Middle East, because at some point, you may need to land or put different assets in these bases. So first of all, just generally, bases are important. And in the military, they talk about something called ABO, access, basing, and overflight. A great example, just generally not tied specifically to the weekend strikes, is Egypt. If you look at the Suez Canal and you look at any transportation or logistics path any U.S. military flight might need, generally, if you're coming from the Mediterranean and Europe and you're going west or you're going east, you're going to transit Egyptian airspace. So we have an entire military infrastructure, coordination and liaison in Egypt to work on just being able to process overflight requests, because the United States would never overfly the airspace of one of our partners without receiving their permission. So in the specific context of Operation Midnight Hammer, a few points. The first is, what's clear about the B-2 bomber flight path is that as much as possible, it was through maritime and international airspace, not through the sovereign airspace of any U.S. ally, partner, or adversary. Number two is, it appears, at least from what's publicly available, that the aircraft transited Syrian airspace and Iraqi airspace. And there we have U.S. forces present on the ground to this day, continuing to support the Defeat ISIS coalition. And finally, what happened in the days leading up to this operation is tremendous assets that were deployed not on land, so that our fighter aircraft didn't just have to be on land. For example, 2 aircraft carrier groups deployed to the Middle East. And finally, it is worth noting that our partners in the Middle East, specifically of the Gulf, who host significant numbers of U.S. forces, have been regularly threatened by Iranian officials. If you support the United States and the U.S. military, we will target you. And so what's clear about Operation Midnight Hammer's operational design is it was intended to be extremely sensitive to the threats facing our partners and not make requests of them that would put them in the crosshairs of Iran or put them at even more heightened risk than they already are for Iranian retaliatory options. We saw fighter aircraft squadrons, obviously a nuclear capable missile submarine coming through maritime space, all to avoid putting U.S. partners and allies in difficult situations.
Okay, thank you. Mike Herzog, I have a number of questions revolving around the big outstanding issue of the stockpile of enriched uranium. Some questioners ask, Israel certainly had to have its own operational plans to address this. Did the events of this weekend either undermine or derail what Israel's original plans would have been to address the stockpile? Secondly, does Israel still have plans? I don't expect you to spill the secret beans on this program, but in your view, does Israel still have its own plans to address the question of the stockpile? And then thirdly, more broadly, is there a legitimate fear that in the near term, Iran could turn this stockpile in some fashion into a weapon, whether it's a dirty bomb or some other tool that it can use, not in the long range, but in the near term, as part of this conflict?
So to begin with, the Israeli plan was, if we have to do it alone, we'll do it alone. And Israel developed plans to deal with all the major facilities, including Fordo. Of course, as I said, the U.S. involvement makes things different. It's a very different picture. But if you really want an answer to the question, look at what happened today. Israel today took action in Fordo. Following the U.S. Air Force, the Israeli Air Force took action in Fordo. So we are following up. So nothing that they did contradicts or impedes what we do, or vice versa. I think they complement each other. But Israel is not going to stop until it is confident that it dealt with the main components of this program. Again, it's not total destruction, but it's a very, very significant blow, setting them back by hopefully a few years. And as I said, creating the conditions for follow-on pressure that will deny them the ability to reconstruct. As relates to the enriched material, there's less concern that Iran could take this enriched material and race to the bomb. I think that's much more difficult for them to do today following the war, because the main elements for weaponization we're taking away from them. But there is concern lest they take this enriched material, enrich it to military grades, 90%, and hide it somewhere. They don't need many centrifuges for that. So it depends to what extent they have this material, they put their hands on it, and they can then enrich it further.
Just let me connect this to a quick question for Dana. Mike mentioned that the Israelis did bomb Fordo in the last 24 hours. Do you interpret this as an Israeli comment that perhaps we didn't, what was the word that the Secretary of Defense used, obliterate, that we didn't definitively obliterate Fordo?
I would interpret the IDF follow-up operations as cleanup on aisle 6. Generally, as a senior official of any government expressing high confidence in what military strikes have accomplished before sufficient time for a damage assessment, usually puts you in a position of having to modify whatever you said. Number one is we know that no military operation on its own will completely eliminate the Iranian nuclear program. Both Ambassadors Ross and Herzog have talked about the need for negotiations and diplomacy on the other side of military force. And number two, it's an obvious point, but Fordo and the enriched uranium stockpile was much discussed and debated in the days leading up to the U.S. strike. And the notion that the Iranian regime would have just kept everything in place waiting for either Israeli or U.S. strikes without trying to divert some of it, I think is underestimates Iranian resolve. And so part of what will have to happen in the following weeks, we know quite well, based on what the Israelis have already done, exquisite intelligence penetration of the Iranian system and the locations of both confirmed nuclear facilities and places that had past associations with nuclear weaponization elements of Iran's nuclear program. And it is that intense and precise intelligence coordination combined with military operations that will be necessary here. And also, it's why we still have to preserve a role for inspectors and some sort of element on the ground that can verify the security of that stockpile and the rest of the elements of Iran's program that could have been or appear to be used to cross the nuclear threshold.
Okay, thank you. Dennis, let me ask you about this the process of diplomacy. When you think about potential diplomatic outcomes, we're clearly in a well, let me not maybe not make the assertion. Is it reasonable to assume that we are at a moment when enrichment is clearly off the table for Iran? There was always this debate within certainly an intra-American debate, an American-European debate about restrictions, inspections, et cetera, limited enrichment. Have we now, is that debate now OBE, overtaken by events?
I think the short answer is yes, but I think Mike touched on something in his presentation where he talked about the issue of Iran retaining the right to enrich, in a sense, giving them some face savers. If the Russians and or the Chinese are going to somehow play a role in mediation, they will understand that there are limits as to what we can accept, but they will also try to provide some face savers for the Iranians. I do think that is something that is likely to emerge on the table. I think for us to be able to go along with that, there would have to be at least an understanding that if we actually saw them act on that right, that would trigger military force again. And having acted the way we did, and having seen the Israelis do what they did, such a threat would be highly credible. And I don't think anybody who helps in the mediation is going to want to mediate something that will then break down relatively soon. So there's a strange convergence of interest here. I want to just touch on one other thing I was sort of getting at, but didn't quite explain. You have both the president having made a point, but wants this to be over. You have the supreme leader who needs to make a point, and he will do something along the retaliatory options. Even if there's a ceasefire, I wouldn't be surprised to see the Iranians, whatever they have left, do a barrage, at least against Israel, right before the ceasefire takes place. And then I see a negotiating process that is designed to ensure that the Israelis, they don't have to add a lot to be able to say, we achieved what we needed to achieve. Iran is never going to be a threat again to us in the nuclear way. And the Iranians they'll say, look at all the damage we inflicted on Israel. We still have our right to enrich. That, I think, are the outlines of what will eventually be some kind of diplomatic settlement. The most important thing for me is not just the nuclear issue. Fundamentally, no one in the region is going to look at Iran the same way they did before this. And the whole structure that Iran presented to the region through a network of proxies and their own threats, that has been decimated. Iran right now is not in a position to be coercing the rest of the region. The rest of the region, it creates an opportunity to create the real coalition that we have been thinking about for some time.
Well, let me build on that last comment and note that, Mike, earlier you referred to some of the targets that Israel had in its bombing today, much closer to regime security targets, the headquarters of the Basij, for example. Whether or not it's an objective of Israeli or American action, one cannot rule out the possibility that things happen in Tehran. That the regime we saw it was more fragile militarily than people assume. Perhaps it's more fragile politically than we assume. I'd like to ask all the panelists, are we prepared for the potential for regime fragility and regime collapse, not necessarily as a result of our targeting their leadership, but just because of inherent fragility of the regime? What would that mean? What would we be doing? What would we be putting in place to ensure security, to help this move in the most positive direction? Are we taking these steps? What would you recommend? Mike, I'll begin with you, since it was your Air Force that hit the Basij.
First of all, regime change has to be done by Iranians, not by the Israeli Air Force. Iranians themselves have to change their regime. I don't rule out that as a result of this war, the regime will be destabilized, and there could be a chain reaction that will ultimately bring about the downfall of this regime. It's very hard to say what happens then, or if the supreme leader departs the scene, what happens. The overall assumption is that more likely there will be some kind of IRGC or military type leadership, even if there is a figurehead of a new supreme leader. Most people in our system, in our government, by the way, believe that no matter what, the picture will be better without Khamenei as supreme leader, with all the things that he has done. It is, of course, a desired outcome of both Israel and the United States that there will be a different regime in Iran, but it's very hard to guarantee that and to say, what will be the sequence of event after the war.
Comments from Dana and Dennis?
All right. I think, any authoritarian regime, when it goes through a succession period, is at its most vulnerable. We're not necessarily seeing succession now, but one thing is very clear. If you look at Iran today, the Khamenei approach has failed at very high cost to Iran. Huge investments in the proxy network, huge investments in Syria, and huge investments in a nuclear program that has been largely destroyed. To think that that won't have some effect in Iran over time, I think it sort of strains the bounds of credulity. Point two, if we're really seeing fragility in the regime, one of the things we might see is a split in the Revolutionary Guard or a split in the Basij. These, after all, will be the elements that would have to be responding and essentially killing Iranians who might come out on the streets. If we see some split and decide not to do it, or if we see some who decide to align with what looks like a public, here again, we have another indication of change. The problem, this reinforces what Mike said, there's no organized opposition, no organized focal point to confront, to challenge the regime, because the regime basically kills or imprisons anybody who emerges. So it's pretty hard to identify anybody that you could be supporting, even quietly. The opposition outside of Iran competes with each other more than they do with the regime. So pretty hard to identify with anybody on the outside. And I think we learned from Iraq, dealing only with those who are outside Iraq isn't a very good prescription for trying to affect the future within, in this case, within Iran. I do think it's important for us to begin to try to identify who could be elements that begin to emerge, and to think about ways of at least, again, trying to, in a public information way, affect and get to the Iranian public. But that may also cut across the desire of the administration to negotiate a conclusion to this. Just as going after Khamenei may go against what President Trump wants, because he wants someone to be able to negotiate with, even if it's indirectly, even if it's through others. So I think there's a tension in objectives right now, but we should position ourselves with an anticipation that the regime may not be as fragile as Assad's was, but we are likely to see some real potential for change over time, especially, as I said, this is a regime whose policies unmistakably failed at an extraordinarily high cost to the Iranian public.
Thank you. Dana, you want to weigh in?
I do. In my view, is a lot of loose talk in Washington about regime change. What we're talking about is regime collapse, which is a very different thing. And I think at least for those in Washington or Jerusalem who are looking at this and putting out into the open this idea of regime collapse, providing a better outcome for Israeli, American, or regional security interests on the other side, should approach that challenge with deep humility. As Dennis said, the experience of the United States in changing governments and having a more stable outcome on the other side, especially in the near term, the historical record demonstrates that rarely happens. If there were to be regime collapse, there are a number of immediate issues that I would hope U.S. planners are thinking through. For example, a long and documented history of the Iranian regime hosting the senior leaders of al-Qaeda and facilitating their travel between Afghanistan and Tehran. The implications for the global jihadist network are significant. What about the security of all of the weapons of this regime or the stockpile that Mike referenced? Real tremendous issues, and in a fog of regime collapse, regime fragility, or the supreme leader not actually exerting command and control over the apparatus of the government, real immediate urgent security challenges that would need to be addressed. And finally, The most likely scenario here is that there would be, if there were to be some sort of change, not necessarily a leadership that would be favorable or conducive to improve relationships with Israel or the United States. But I do think it's important to emphasize here that President Trump has demonstrated that with new leadership, even in governments that historically have been adversarial to the United States, he is willing to give the benefit of the doubt. And the best example here is the new transitional government of Ahmed al-Shara, who replaced Bashar al-Assad in Syria and Damascus. This is a leader who is saying certain things, taking some important actions to address real U.S. security interests, has not discarded the potential of normalizing relations with Israel at some point, actively working to dismantle the Iran threat network that's still just trying to work through Syria, worked to foil some of the plots again organized by ISIS in Syria, and in exchange, with only a few months of a demonstrated record of doing some of the things that the United States asked of him, he was given vast sanctions relief by the United States, which opens up opportunities for the Syrian people to get much more than humanitarian aid, for the Syrian economy to receive the necessary stabilization, for the Syrian economy to plug back into the international community. And so if you are skeptical in Iran and you're looking at what are the options on the other side of this regime, who in no way has invested in benefiting the Iranian people, you actually do have a model for what that alternative path could be right across the region.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I'm going to turn just to one final question to Mike Herzog. Lots of people are asking me about how Israel is faring up now that we're 10 days into this conflict. Could you say a word about Israel, a historically politically volatile, disputatious country? Where is the politics in Israel today, 10 days into this conflict? Are Israelis have Israelis put aside the deep political differences that they had the day before this conflict, this phase of the conflict began? Do they remain confident in their government's ability to provide the defensive capabilities to protect against the incoming missiles? Are they confident that the United States is there defensively, as well as what we have seen over this weekend in terms of the offensive action in Iran? Could you just say a bit about, where is Israel on all this today?
Yes, so as I noted, there's a broad consensus in Israel around this war. It's very different than other issues where we debate each other and our society is split, and we've seen a lot of it in recent years. When it comes to Iran, I think most Israelis agree that this is an existential threat that has to be removed. And people align behind this move, behind the government's decision. There's no politics here. The opposition supported, all the opposition parties supported the campaign against Iran. And you see very few people really accusing the prime minister or the government of taking our country to war out of partisan political consideration. That is definitely not the case. And our society is very resilient. We've been at war since October 7th and paid a very, very heavy price. Our nation is in trauma, but our society is extremely resilient. And we are paying a price, even a heavy price, by Iranian missiles. But people are willing to pay that price, knowing and trusting that ultimately we are going to remove that existential threat.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to thank all three of you. This has been a superlative discussion. I'm quite confident that all of our viewers are far better informed about what happened and what is likely to happen in the days and weeks ahead, thanks to your remarks. Let me thank you, Dana Stroll, Mike Herzog from Israel, and Dennis Ross. Thank you for joining us today, everyone, on this special Washington Institute Policy Forum.